that was the attraction. And, people think, oh, it was sex, it was this. Not at all. I never had sex with him. He was very kind, very soft, very loving.
On stage, Elvis Presley looked unstoppable. Hips shaking, lights flashing, screams drowning every doubt. But behind Graceland's wrought iron gates, the king erected a velvet barrier no admirer could see and no lover could cross. Tonight, we peel back that curtain. Why did a man worshipped by millions ask a 14-year-old stranger to change her hair, her clothes, even her silence, then spend years keeping her at arm's length? Why did the world cheer a fairy tale romance while the bride stood frozen like a porcelain doll, forbidden to touch the very legend she lived with? And how did that impossibly perfect myth finally fracture, revealing a loneliness as vast as the Presley empire itself? Stay with us, because the answers rewrite everything you thought you knew about America's most iconic love story. And they begin long before Priscilla ever set foot inside the house that felt more like a shrine than a home. It was 1959 in West Germany, just another quiet military base, just another year of relocation for 14-year-old Priscilla Bulio. Her stepfather, stationed with the U.S. Air Force, expected the usual: new school, new faces, and his shy stepdaughter blending into the background. But then came the invitation, not from a classmate, not from a teacher, from Elvis Presley, the Elvis. He was 24, already a global superstar, and completing his military service in Friedberg. At first, everyone thought it was a prank. Why would the king of rock and roll want to meet a 9th grade girl? But it wasn't a joke. It was real. He had seen a photo, heard about her from a mutual friend, and asked that she come to his house. Her parents were rightfully alarmed. A superstar, a mansion, a child, it didn't add up. But Elvis was persuasive. He phoned them directly, charmed them with yes sirs and no ma'ams, promised there would be adults present, that everything would be respectful. He assured them Priscilla would be safe. And so, one night, wearing her school uniform and a face full of nerves, Priscilla entered Elvis's world. From the moment she stepped inside, the mood shifted. Elvis, grieving the recent loss of his mother, was surrounded by friends but emotionally adrift. And here was this young girl, quiet, gentle, respectful, who reminded him of home, of softness, of innocence. He didn't try to impress her. He opened up. He cried, he played the piano, he asked about her life, and Priscilla, swept up in a whirlwind no teenager could truly grasp, was mesmerized. This wasn't just a pop idol. This was a broken man who had made her feel seen, chosen. What began as a surreal night turned into a routine. She'd visit again and again. Hours turned into sleepovers. The rumors came quickly, but Elvis dismissed them. He insisted they hadn't been physical. And technically, he may have been telling the truth. But that didn't erase the power imbalance, the inappropriateness, or the optics. Elvis was a grown man with the most famous face in the world. Priscilla was a 14-year-old schoolgirl still doing homework. Yet somehow, the world didn't flinch. Not the media, not the parents, not the people cheering outside his home. Because he was Elvis. And in 1959, when fame smiled wide enough, the rules tended to bend. Soon after those candlelit evenings in Friedberg, the subtle instructions began, quiet suggestions wrapped in compliments that sounded like chivalry but felt like choreography. First came the hair. Elvis asked Priscilla to tint it raven black, the mirror image of his own slick pompadour. "It brings out your eyes," he told her, and the teenage girl who had never owned a bottle of dye obeyed. Next, he coaxed her toward a softer makeup palette, powdery foundation, a pastel lip, eyeliner so precise it resembled porcelain doll's lashes. Loud colors, he warned, would steal her natural innocence. Then the wardrobe rules followed. Demure dresses that cinched at the waist but never rose above the knee. Neutral shades that photographed well beside a sequined jumpsuit. Piece by piece, Priscilla's reflection was reshaped until the girl in the glass looked less like a high school student and more like a living accessory designed for the Presley brand. Outside the mansion gates, magazines gushed over Elvis's muse, and fashion pages copied her silhouette, never questioning who authored the look. Reporters called her transformation a fairy tale makeover. Disciples of rock and roll dubbed them the perfect pair. What the cameras missed was how narrow her world was becoming. Each compliment pinned her into a tighter frame. Each small edict sounded like devotion, yet functioned as control. Even in private conversation, Elvis steered her vocabulary. No coarse slang, no teenage giggles, because the king preferred quiet grace. The irony? America thought it was watching a Cinderella story, but the glass slipper had already fused to Priscilla's foot. She couldn't grow, couldn't stumble, couldn't change size without shattering the illusion. By the early 1960s, whispers of good girl purity amplified the myth. The biggest star alive had chosen a shy military kid over Hollywood starlets. Rarely did anyone ask why that purity mattered so much, or what it cost the girl maintaining it. And when a 2023 biopic tiptoed around these early demands, younger audiences were stunned to learn the makeover had not been a stylist's brainstorm, but the opening chapter of years-long control. The brand glittered, the girl faded. But clothing was only the first set of rules. Once Priscilla crossed the Atlantic and moved behind Graceland's ornate gates, the dress code spread to every corner of her life. Friends, curfews, even opinions required clearance. Coming up next, how a palatial mansion, teeming with bodyguards and hangers-on, became a gilded cage where the queen-in-waiting couldn't even choose when to leave the house. When Priscilla finally crossed the threshold of Graceland in 1963, the front door might as well have locked behind her with a presidential seal. The mansion shimmered under Memphis sunlight, sprawling lawns, marble staircases, a private cinema, but every sparkling surface served a single purpose: to shelter Elvis's legend and police anyone who lived inside it. Rules arrived faster than house tours. Priscilla needed written permission, or at least a nod from one of the king's ever-present bodyguards, before she could visit a store down the street. Friends? Only those Elvis approved, and even then, conversations happened in public rooms where staff floated just close enough to overhear. Telephone lines ran through the switchboard first. Every call could be logged, any schedule change vetoed by Elvis's inner circle, the so-called Memphis Mafia. Even bedtime wasn't her decision. If the king stayed up talking gospel till dawn, so did she. From the outside, fans gawked at the endless parties, imagining rock and roll excess. Inside, Graceland functioned like a cloister where time obeyed one man's insomnia and prudence. Gates swung open at his whim, closed on hers. Priscilla's world shrank to a handful of ornate rooms, a wardrobe of pre-selected dresses, and the constant hum of a myth in the making. The teenage girl who once worried about biology homework now navigated a palace where even laughter had a decibel limit if camera crews were near. Yet gossip columns still called her the luckiest woman alive, mistaking gold leaf for freedom. But bricks and chandeliers were only half the prison. The other half lived inside Elvis's mind, a vision of innocence so fragile it demanded distance the moment Priscilla grew closer to womanhood. Up next, we'll examine the psychological barrier more powerful than any locked gate, Elvis's Madonna complex, and how it turned intimacy into a forbidden frontier. When Priscilla finally crossed the threshold of Graceland in 1963, the front door might as well have locked behind her with a presidential seal. The mansion shimmered under Memphis sunlight, sprawling lawns, marble staircases, a private cinema, but every sparkling surface served a single purpose: to shelter Elvis's legend and police anyone who lived inside it. Rules arrived faster than house tours. Priscilla needed written permission, or at least a nod from one of the king's ever-present bodyguards, before she could visit a store down the street. Friends? Only those Elvis approved. And even then, conversations happened in public rooms where staff floated just close enough to overhear. Telephone lines ran through the switchboard first. Every call could be logged, any schedule change vetoed by Elvis's inner circle, the so-called Memphis Mafia. Even bedtime wasn't her decision. If the king stayed up talking gospel till dawn, so did she. From the outside, fans gawked at the endless parties, imagining rock and roll excess. Inside, Graceland functioned like a cloister where time obeyed one man's insomnia and prudence. Gates swung open at his whim, closed on hers. Priscilla's world shrank to a handful of ornate rooms, a wardrobe of pre-selected dresses, and the constant hum of a myth in the making. The teenage girl who once worried about biology homework now navigated a palace where even laughter had a decibel limit if camera crews were near. Yet gossip columns still called her the luckiest woman alive, mistaking gold leaf for freedom. But bricks and chandeliers were only half the prison. The other half lived inside Elvis's mind, a vision of innocence so fragile it demanded distance the moment Priscilla grew closer to womanhood. Up next, we'll examine the psychological barrier more powerful than any locked gate, Elvis's Madonna complex, and how it turned intimacy into a forbidden frontier. To the public, Elvis and Priscilla were royalty. Glamorous, inseparable, destined. But behind the bedroom doors of Graceland, the reality was far colder. While the tabloids imagined passion and candlelit nights, Priscilla lived in a strange purgatory, emotionally bound to the most desired man on earth, yet untouched. Elvis kissed her, held her hand, posed with her for family-friendly portraits, but stopped short of anything more. Years passed. She waited, and the silence between them only grew louder. No explanations came, just long absences and mood swings, and a growing sense that something was deeply, painfully off. It wasn't until much later, during quiet moments and rare admissions, that Elvis confessed a truth Priscilla would never forget. He couldn't be intimate with a woman who was a mother. The phrase stunned her, and still echoes today, because by then, she was a mother. Their daughter, Lisa Marie, had been born. But with that birth came the end of whatever lingering closeness they had. Psychologists call it the Madonna whore complex, a mental split where men idolize purity to such an extreme that real, complex women become unreal. The image mattered more than the woman. He wanted the angelic girl from Germany, untouched, suspended in time. Once Priscilla became a wife and a mother, she crossed a line he couldn't accept. Not out of malice, but out of fear. She had entered the real world, and that realness shattered the myth. Elvis couldn't or wouldn't reconcile the two. Intimacy dried up. Emotional connection became a memory, and Priscilla was left questioning everything. Was she no longer beautiful? No longer lovable? What had she done wrong? The answer was nothing, except grow up. And for Elvis, that growth broke the illusion. She stayed. Of course she stayed. Because love told her to wait, to hope, to believe that one day the man she adored would reappear. But love, when measured in distance and silence, starts to decay. And as Elvis pulled further into himself, into pills, paranoia, and nostalgia, Priscilla's world grew colder. Still, she kept up appearances, smiled for the cameras, played the role, because Graceland wasn't just a home, it was a stage. But behind the velvet curtains, the star had stopped reaching for his leading lady. Coming up next, as Elvis unraveled under the weight of his own fame, the cracks in their carefully polished image began to spread, until the king's secret chaos became Priscilla's daily reality. For over a decade, Priscilla Presley had played her part with grace. She had smiled through loneliness, posed through heartbreak, and waited for the man she loved to return, not just in body, but in spirit. But by the early 1970s, something inside her began to shift. It didn't happen during one of Elvis's lavish concerts or after a cruel remark. It happened quietly, privately, when she realized she still had a heartbeat that wasn't tethered to his. That moment of awakening came, ironically, through an affair. Her own. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about scandal. It was about survival. For the first time in years, Priscilla felt something stir inside her, a sense of self, of desire, of being seen. The encounter was brief, but its impact was seismic. It reminded her that she was human, that she still had agency, that life existed beyond the stage-managed fantasy of Graceland. That moment didn't break her marriage. It revealed that it had already been broken for a long time. And with that truth, Priscilla found clarity. She couldn't keep living inside a myth that demanded her silence, her sacrifice, her disappearance. In 1972, she told Elvis the truth. There were no screaming matches, no public spectacles, just quiet devastation. Elvis cried. She cried. Because despite everything, the distance, the betrayals, they still shared something real. Grief. The grief of a love that couldn't evolve, of a partnership that had never been equal, of a dream that had turned into a performance neither of them could sustain. Their divorce was finalized in 1973, and in a rare moment of raw humanity, they walked out of the courtroom hand in hand. It wasn't for the cameras, it was their final goodbye. A symbolic gesture that said, "We meant something, even if it couldn't last." Years later, Priscilla would say, "I still loved Elvis very much, but I had to leave." That single sentence speaks volumes, because sometimes love isn't enough, especially when it's built on a version of yourself you no longer recognize. When Priscilla Presley left Graceland, many expected her to fade into the footnotes of rock and roll history, a relic of Elvis's glittering reign. But instead, she began to write a new story. No longer tethered to the myth of the king, she emerged, quietly, powerfully, into her own name, her own image, and her own legacy. In the years immediately following their divorce, she focused on the one thing Elvis never could fully give her: independence. She moved to Los Angeles, took acting lessons, and raised their daughter Lisa Marie with fierce devotion. It wasn't a public comeback. It was a private resurrection. Her career began modestly, with television appearances and guest roles, but her breakthrough came with the wildly successful Naked Gun film series. Audiences who had once viewed her as Elvis's porcelain bride now saw her delivering deadpan comedy on the big screen. It was a revelation. Priscilla wasn't just poised, she was poised, clever, and sharp. She had range. But even more transformative than her acting was her role as a businesswoman. After Elvis's death in 1977, Graceland was bleeding money. The estate was on the brink of collapse, and many urged her to sell it off. Instead, Priscilla made a bold move. She took control of Elvis Presley Enterprises and transformed his private mansion into a public pilgrimage site. Under her leadership, Graceland became one of the most profitable private museums in the world. It wasn't just a tribute to Elvis. It was a strategic empire, and Priscilla was at its helm. She turned grief into stewardship, tragedy into enterprise. What's more, she never publicly attacked Elvis. She didn't need to. She spoke of his kindness, his pain, his struggles, not to excuse them, but to humanize them. Even while asserting her independence, she protected the man who had once tried to keep her in a glass box. That loyalty, that complexity, made her story resonate. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was reclaiming balance. As she built her brand, Priscilla also became a voice for women navigating power imbalances, emotional control, and the cost of idolization. She told her story carefully, honestly, and with dignity. In doing so, she allowed millions to revisit the Presley saga not as a fairy tale, but as a cautionary tale about love, identity, and freedom. But Priscilla's reinvention wasn't complete. In recent years, new headlines began emerging. Family battles over inheritance, legal threats to Graceland, and rumors of a tell-all memoir that could rewrite the Presley legacy once again. Up next, the 2020s would test everything Priscilla had built, forcing her to fight not only for Elvis's name, but for her own place in the history she helped shape. Decades after Elvis's death, Priscilla Presley's role in shaping his legacy seemed secure, until the storm hit. In 2023, the Presley estate faced an unexpected legal crisis. Just months after the tragic passing of Lisa Marie Presley, Priscilla found herself in a highly publicized battle with her granddaughter, actress Riley Coe, over control of Elvis Presley Enterprises. At stake wasn't just money, it was ownership of the Presley name, the Graceland property, and the story itself. What had once been a carefully guarded shrine became the center of a family feud playing out in headlines. Court documents revealed conflicting interpretations of Lisa Marie's amended will, and for the first time in years, Priscilla was portrayed not as the grieving matriarch, but as a challenger to her granddaughter's authority. The media split its loyalties. Some called her power-hungry, others called her protective. But behind the headlines, the truth was more complicated. Priscilla wasn't trying to seize control, she was trying to preserve a legacy she had spent over 40 years defending. The resolution was quiet. Riley and Priscilla reached a settlement, and publicly, both women spoke of unity and love. But it marked a new chapter. For the first time, Priscilla was no longer the sole guardian of Elvis's memory. Then came the 2024 foreclosure scare. News broke that Graceland was allegedly being auctioned off due to unpaid debts. Fans panicked. Was the king's castle really being taken away? Priscilla stepped in immediately, calling the foreclosure attempt fraudulent and backing Riley as the rightful heir. Together, they launched a legal counterstrike and won. The sale was blocked. The headlines faded, but the alarm had already sounded. The house that once symbolized immortality had become vulnerable. And now, in 2025, rumors swirl around a possible memoir, one that Priscilla has quietly teased for years. Industry insiders suggest this book could unveil never-before-told truths, not just about Elvis's control, but about her personal transformation, her heartbreak, and the price she paid to stay silent all those years. If it's published, it could be the most revealing Presley story yet, not told by biographers or journalists, but by the woman who lived it. What's become clear is that Priscilla isn't done fighting, not for money, not for fame, but for her own narrative. The myth of Elvis Presley was built with her help. Now, she's making sure her voice is no longer the quiet echo in the background. Next, we'll reflect on the legacy of that voice, what it cost her, what it taught us, and how the greatest illusion of all might not have been Elvis himself, but the idea that love without freedom was ever real. Priscilla Presley's story forces us to ask a question few dared to raise while the king was alive. What is the cost of being loved for who you represent, not for who you are? For years, she stood beside Elvis like a living statue, flawless, graceful, silent. The world saw perfection. But perfection, when imposed from the outside, becomes a prison. What Priscilla endured wasn't physical abuse or public scandal. It was something quieter, more insidious, a slow erasure of self in the name of devotion. She was adored, yes, but she was also controlled, curated, and contained. And that's the part many fans overlook, because it's tempting to romanticize their story, to believe in the fairy tale. But when we strip away the sequins and candlelight, we find a relationship defined not by mutual growth, but by emotional power imbalance. Elvis didn't want a partner. He wanted a projection, a girl who would never challenge him, a woman who would never outgrow the role he designed. And for years, Priscilla tried to play that role perfectly, until one day, perfection became unbearable. This isn't just a story about two people. It's a warning about the dangers of idolization, about the cost of silencing your needs to maintain someone else's fantasy. Priscilla gave up her youth, her voice, her choices, all for the illusion of love. And in return, she was placed on a pedestal so high she could no longer move without risking a fall. She lived the life millions envied, but inside, she was unraveling. What makes her story remarkable isn't that she walked away from Elvis, it's that she found the courage to walk toward herself, to reclaim her voice, to tell the truth, even when it meant challenging the myth. Because myths, no matter how glittering, are not meant to replace real lives. And now, all these years later, Priscilla Presley stands not just as a figure from rock history, but as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that loyalty shouldn't come at the cost of selfhood, that being seen is more valuable than being displayed, and that sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is stop being the muse and become the author of her own story. In the end, Priscilla Presley didn't just walk away from a man, she walked away from a myth that millions adored, but one that required her to disappear behind glass to keep it alive. She had the mansion, the title, the world's most famous last name, but none of it could replace what she lost along the way: her spontaneity, her freedom, her voice. And when she finally stepped out of the fantasy, she wasn't running from Elvis, she was running back to herself. That's what makes her story more than a Hollywood tale. It's a mirror, a reflection of every person who's ever been told to be quiet, to be perfect, to be small for someone else's comfort. Because this wasn't just Elvis's dream. It was a dream scripted, lit, and directed by fame, and maintained by silence. And silence can feel like loyalty until it starts to feel like suffocation. Priscilla's greatest act of love wasn't staying, it was leaving. Not in anger, but in truth. She let go of the illusion and found something deeper, herself. Her real story, full of cracks and courage, still speaks to anyone who has ever felt unseen in a relationship, anyone who's ever loved someone too much to see themselves clearly. So here's the question: what do we do with a love story that was never really love? Do we preserve it? Do we rewrite it, or do we finally listen to the woman who lived through it, who lived after it? If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt trapped in someone else's version of who you should be, you're not alone. Priscilla's story isn't just a cautionary tale about fame, it's a survival story. And it's a reminder that no matter how beautiful the cage, freedom is always worth the flight. Subscribe for more untold truths from behind the red carpets and rhinestones, the stories the headlines never told you. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Elvis truly loved Priscilla, or did he only love the version of her he created? Because sometimes the hardest thing to see is the truth that was right behind the curtain all along.